Let's pick up the phrase that I was just completing on side 2 of the theme of creation, in which I was observing that it's the inherent nature of the whim to go on pushing, erupting, increasing complexity until finally a state of material complexity has been reached, at which point a level of consciousness can be generated capable of reflection and consciously knowing itself as God. At that point, at that stage, the basic inherent push of the whim is fulfilled. Baba tells us, of course, that this occurs in the first human incarnation. At that point, the quota of consciousness to be generated is complete, and all human incarnations then are involved or are concerned with only one matter, and that is unwinding, discharging the sanskaras which have been generated throughout the long, long course of evolution. So, at any rate, now we've covered phase 1, an enormous phase of the theme of creation, from the original state of God up to the first human incarnation. Well, let's do just a few moments of review of some of the high salient points of that. The first and most important of all to be very, very clear on, and not just to be a bit philosophical about, but to realize that this has to be the framework within which you and I and all of the rest of humanity operate. And that is that reality, Baba tells us, all the great mystics tell us, the avatars tell us, that reality is God, and that God is infinite, eternal, and I remind you that all questions of time exist only in our minds, within imagination. But from our standpoint, He is eternal. There was never any beginning and will never be any end of God, and He is also indivisible, which means that everything that looks like separateness or contrast, difference, up or down, again exists only in our own minds as imagination. And then we get to this extremely difficult thing to digest for many people, and that is that the original beyond the beyond state of God, the origin of God, was 100% unconscious, but with the innate, inherent whim, capability, potential to wish to know His own divinity consciously. And when, as Baba says, for reasons that are impossible to put into words or in logic, that whim began to move, then automatically all of the conditions, in fact, all of creation, flowed out of the disturbance created by that whim. We did a couple of stop cameras at critical points of the moving of that whim, just the instant that it started, and compared it to the only thing that we can compare it as we know it, which is a wave motion. Or if you don't like to look at it as a wave, as a compression followed by a rarefaction. Look at it however you want. It is a disturbance of contrast. This is basically the fundamental nature of all of creation as we know it, as we are able to analyze it and to break it down. And secondly, within this wave, there is the crest and there is the trough, which is automatically contrast, even though it is all within the same body of, let us say, this huge lake or ocean or pond, however we want to conceive it. And so here we have, first of all, the basic energy condition of creation, and secondly, the basic fundamental mechanism for the creation of consciousness. Immediately, this so-called contrast in the top and the bottom of the wave gave the first primitive ability for experience between contrast, between apparent opposites, that was imprinted upon the impressionable God Himself, The first iota of consciousness was born instantly, and the first sanskara was born instantly. But this was an extremely primitive state of consciousness, and also of habit patterns and of matter. And what was produced at that point came nowhere within light years of being able to be a type of consciousness which could turn upon itself, reflect, and ultimately know itself as God. And so the whim continued to complexify, to erupt, to throw disturbance, more complex waveforms, finally becoming simple material condensed forms, and so on, from the subgaseous forms, liquids, stones, metals, and so on, straight on up to the most advanced animal forms. And there was where we stopped the first phase of the theme of creation. So let's leave it there then, I hope, for your sakes, until the next occasion. But I think it would be wise to reflect a little bit on some of the fundamentals that we've discussed in this first part. All of you have read them, discussed them at some point or another, but it always impresses upon me because I've been so impressed with my own obtuseness and stupidity over the course of the years of failing to realize the importance of these first fundamental simple things that Baba tells us about God and about the beginning of creation. Because if we reflect upon them, digest them, absorb their implications, inevitably a great deal of what we have to discuss and go through as human beings becomes much more apparent, and we see the inevitableness of the whole procedure. So, for the moment, Baba be with you. This is Don again, about to take up the second part of the theme of creation. You recall in the first part, we took up the stage of God in his original beyond the beyond, totally unconscious stage, the surging of the whim, what it produced, and the mechanism of evolution, up through the most complex animal stage to the first human incarnation. We also described, but I'm afraid albeit much too briefly, the fundamental structure of drop souls and the appendages to the individual drop soul. In other words, as it were, a bubble, a seeming bubble of God, which is the drop soul, which seems to be separated from other drop souls, which even seems to be cut off from God himself, and tied to it a specific, very, very light, ethereal, ephemeral mental body. Within that mental body, stored by a mechanism that I'm afraid you'll get a little tired of hearing me referring to as the black box tape recorder, all of the memories, the things that have happened to that drop soul from the time that it started out on the long circle. Then, secondly, in addition to the mental body, the subtle body, that of the emotions, the forces that finally are put into motion to energize the physical body and carry out absolute physical actions. And the physical body itself, of course, being the most dense of the three bodies and the one of which we are most aware. When the physical body becomes worn out because it exists in such a dense state of matter that a wearing out process is quite appreciable, and so the soul has to be attached via the other two bodies to a long succession of physical bodies. Now, as far as I know, and perhaps some of you may have found something on the subject that I am absolutely unaware of, but as far as I know, Baba does not describe the repository of consciousness during the stages of evolution and involution. I've always suspected that probably in some fashion or another it was probably a property related to one of the three material bodies, mental, subtle, physical, almost certainly in the mental, and I've often speculated in my own mind that the intervention of a perfect one in going from the sixth to the seventh plane is probably associated with transferring that from the succession from, let us say, the plane of materiality, finally into a soul function. Because it is certainly true that as the individual drop soul achieves God realization, all material bodies are dropped eternally, and perfected consciousness is retained eternally within the drop soul infused into God, into the total God, from which it never actually had any separate existence. But at any rate, that's just a little bit of personal speculation, and perhaps there is something that Baba has already given us that clarifies that, or perhaps it's up to you and to me to make a long-term meditation on that and to clarify it. After all, Baba leaves things for us to do. At any rate, let's get back now to where we jump off into part 2 of creation. Again, consciousness is complete as the individual drop soul takes on the first human incarnation. And I know that there's been a great deal of confusion amongst various people. In fact, such an eminent Baba philosopher and such a tremendous Baba lover as Charles Purdom himself, in his book, The God Man, pointed out, according to his opinion, that consciousness goes on evolving in the various human forms. This was picked up, and I had the problem as well as great privilege of acting as a messenger boy between Baba and Purdom to try to straighten out Purdom's inherent feelings on this. Purdom immediately pointed out to me that it was obvious that Purdom at that age, well into his 70s, was a much more conscious individual than he had been as a young boy. As I carried this to Baba, Baba immediately brightened up and began gesturing, and Arish explained the gestures to me that Baba was pointing out that Purdom had confused consciousness with awareness. Well, even that simple differentiation has certain problems in trying to understand, but in any case, you and I should have absolutely no confusion that Baba has said that the most primitive savage man in Africa has just as high a quality of consciousness as the most sophisticated poet, musician, politician, creative individual that you and I have ever been around. In fact, equal to the avatar and the perfect master. The only difference between the savage and the perfected one is that the veil of sanskaras has been removed. Just that simple. Now, we did mention just very briefly in the previous section that the tragedy, and these are Don Stevens's expressions naturally, but from my viewpoint, the tragedy of creation is that consciousness as it is generated does not know itself and identify itself with reality, which is the soul, which is God. Instead, consciousness as it is generated looks at, is aware of, and identifies itself with environment, with the physical environment. So, by the time we get to the human stage, consciousness, Baba explains to us, is 100% identified with the body and the desire patterns. So, this is the big job. All human reincarnations deal with only one thing. They are all wrapped up in, revolve around, and deal constantly with sanskaras, their unknotting and their dissipation. Everything is aimed at that. Now, what did Baba say about a sanskara? And remember that there are several terms which are virtually identical in their meaning. Sanskara is an impression. The impression is a knot of recorded energy within the mental body. And that knot of mental energy, just like any other quantum of energy anywhere, under any circumstance, energy is always trying to dissipate itself, to get loose, to dissipate. And as a consequence, as they are stored in the mental body, they're only waiting the proper chance to jump out of jail, as it were, and to run loose around the landscape and to express themselves. They're really, you might say, the truants of each drop soul entity. And there are millions of them stored up there in the mental body. They are knots of psychic energy which, just like the electrical energy on a cloud, are just looking for the first opportunity to leap to a discharge point, to leap to a church steeple or a tree or to you or me or some other point in the environment. So this is what, let's say, a habit pattern comes from. The particular experience which impressed its knot of psychic energy on the mental body, of course, tries to re-express itself in environment in a similar action. And of course we take that as perfectly normal. Our habit patterns just are. We justify them. They try to express themselves as they were originally learned. And to us that is, we don't even think about it. We're not even conscious of it. All we are is aware of the need to do a particular thing. And then later on, of course, comes the post-rationalization of the event. We try to show that it was moral or that it was necessary or it did good things. But the actual fact of the matter is all of that post-action process, is a lot of sheer baloney. And we might just as well wake up to it and start to become honest with ourselves. We go through all sorts of contortions and get ourselves in messes trying to justify the manner in which that psychic energy knot leaped into action in a favorable environmental complex. And perhaps I should explain that a little bit, what I mean by a favorable environmental complex. Naturally, if you had a Sanskara to melt water, melt ice into water, it'd be very difficult for that Sanskara to express itself in a tropical country. And so if you're living in Central Africa or Central America in the lowlands, that psychic energy knot, which wanted to melt ice into water again, would have to remain suspended. Similarly, there are all sorts of Sanskaras stored up in our mental black box up there, which at a given time, or perhaps even throughout a given lifetime, never encounter the favorable environmental circumstances within which that energy knot can be expressed. And so it remains dormant. But once the favorable environment is arranged, does come into existence, begins to make itself, it's sort of, let's say, like Cinderella, or Sleeping Beauty, coming out of her dream. The environment is the Prince Charming, which is awakening her, and so it expresses itself in action. But I dare say that certain Sanskaras may wait hundreds or even thousands of years before the particular knot of circumstances comes up in which it can be appropriately expressed. Now, I think it might become a little bit more clear then how the mechanism of the individual drop soul being born into a particular family, social, and national environment occurs. We've always been told by the mystics that this is a process of natural attraction. One side of the attraction, let us say the nail, is the sanskaric pattern within our mental body, and it is, as it were, susceptible to being attracted. And so it's attracted into an aborning embryo, which is going to go into an environment which will express a maximum of the close to nascent sanskaras which need to be expressed. So one is not born into a meaningless, stupid, backward family or environment, and so on. So again, let's go back just one moment and repeat this all-important fact, that all of the human incarnations from the time that the drop soul is born into the first human body, all incarnations are concerned with, are wrapped up in, and deal only with the dissipation of the sanskaras. Now, if you'll forgive me, of course you're old-timers with what Baba says, I leap over to the opposite end of this second session together on the theme of creation, to the avatar. And I point out to you that the function of the avatar is to act as the chairman of the board of creation. It is his job to run creation, and it's his job to match up all of the circumstances that are occurring in it in relation to the generation and the perfecting of God's consciousness, to be sure that this is done thoroughly, appropriately, magnificently, and 100% done. I began to be aware of the fact some years ago of how much, after Baba dropped his body, I was still aware of his impact in individual circumstances in my own personal life. And so I was able to clarify this with 2 or 3 of the Mandali, and there was absolutely no question as to what they told me, and there was no question when I went back and read what the Christian Bible said on the subject, and that is life, our lives as human beings, are determined in minute detail by the avatar, and that determination is aimed at the most efficient, thorough, and complete resolution of our sanskaras that can be obtained with all of the current circumstances available. Now, I look upon a given lifetime as being, let's say, sort of a cut-off wedge of the sanskaric pie. It's sort of as if, let us say, the avatar says, all right, Don, in this particular lifetime, I'll cut off this particular circumference of your pie of sanskaras, and it's up to you and the environment that I'm giving you to chew those up and digest them as much as you can. And so I am born into the family, into the social, national, cultural, geographical environment, which will most straightforwardly and most helpfully bring to the surface and resolve those sanskaras. As I discharge those sanskaras, of course, Baba has explained at one point, and there are even here some ambiguities. This is one of the 2 things that Baba said he would have to explain in much greater detail at some point, the precise manner in which the sanskaras worked out. But at any rate, what Baba tells us is that as a sanskara is being discharged into environment, it's just like an automobile running along a road at 90 miles an hour. It's going at a rapid speed with a lot of inertia, and as a consequence, that inertia carries it beyond the balance point. So if I have a particular sanskara that I'm discharging of working very hard in say, the field of mathematics, because that had to be balanced out and expressed, I overexpress mathematics. I carry beyond the point, and as a consequence, I move into the reverse direction. And I'm doing this with a number of important sanskaras which have been cut off into that particular pie wedge of sanskaras for this particular physical incarnation. And as they all come close to, more or less in balance, at that point, I drop the body. Because after all, what is the body? Well, Baba tells us that the body is the net expression of the particular sanskaras that are operant. So, when the sanskaras are in a state of balance, then I drop the body. Now, I may provoke a bit of a catastrophe by artificially dropping my body through suicide. And as you know, that gets into various different complications within itself. But perhaps a little bit more on that later on. So here I am, drop soul Don Stevens in this lifetime, expressing 5 or 10 or 500 or 1,000, I don't know, how many key important sanskaras, and as they are statistically more or less in balance, I drop the body at that point. And the whole mechanism, the timing is pretty well arranged, and so this is about the time the body wears out anyway. But I'm charging beyond, and the impetus, the inertia, carries me on the balance point. And so this explains what Baba has explained to us, or described to us in other areas and other statements, that there is a great tendency for the drop soul, as it is reincarnated in another body, to go into the opposite phase of experience. So that if I've done too much in mathematics, then I come back and maybe do too much in horticulture to balance things. Frankly, I don't know what the opposite of mathematics is, but the one he always gives, of course, is that the individual who is killed is going to end up being killed, who is killing is going to end up being killed in another lifetime. But it is because of the primary inertia which carries us beyond the balance point. Now this certainly looks like if you'll excuse me, one hell of a prognosis for living in this world. It just looks like one is teetering back and forth eternally. But if you absorb various of the things that Baba has described to us, one of the things he says, for instance, is that it takes, a lack of lifetimes, or I don't know, maybe it's many lacks of lifetime. I always get a little bit beboggled by the enormous statistics of how long it takes us to get anywhere. But at any rate, he talks about the great number of lifetimes that are inherently necessary for the dropped soul to begin to loosen the sanskaric knots, so that he can begin to look about himself, consciously wonder what it's all about, and then take that inevitable and essential step of starting consciously to put his foot on the path. But let's look at it in terms which are inherent and involved deeply in what Baba tells us about creation and us as human beings. Let's take a look at what is inevitably happening in that process. And I think it's a rather encouraging thing. As far as one can make out the story, what is actually going on is that your old ego, which is a big pain in the neck, but actually, as Baba tells us, does certain essential functions, such as acting as a coordinating, a digesting point of experience. Our old ego sits around, and even though it's a big old fat ego, it is still wise and realistic enough to begin to realize that this whole business of our working to get what we want isn't quite what it's cracked up to be. So it's our own selfish coordination of events which begins to be just a little bit suspicious about our own motivations, our own intelligence, our own infallibility. The things that we worked so hard, absolutely dead convinced that they were right, that they were inevitable, and that everything that held us away from them was infernal and perverse, we begin to be a bit suspicious of our own goals and our own capabilities. At first, of course, we're very naive about the thing. Everything that goes wrong we blame on somebody else, or that chance and environment tossed up some unfortunate factors in front of us. But finally, even that begins to pale. Somewhere way down involved inside of us, this poor, benighted, dropped soul that's got such a heap of garbage thrown over it, all of these sanskaras beclouding it from so many millions of different lifetimes and experiences. That dropped soul is still there, and one way or another, its knowledge of reality sends a little bit of a glow through here and a little bit of a glow through there. And that is inevitably, let us say, the source of truth, the philosopher's stone, which begins to seep through. And as we ourselves are successively disappointed in different circumstances, try and retry again, and find that goes down the drain, or that even when we succeed, what we had thought was a desirable goal turns out to be vinegar in our mouths, then this tiny bits of rays from the drop soul itself, which gives a beginning base of judgment to our conscious self, begins to seep through. And sure, I suppose we spend a few more thousands of lifetimes going through other combinations and permutations of kidding ourselves, or trying to kid ourselves. But eventually, the amassed evidence of our own personal experience and the integrating point of the ego, it's sort of like a computer, gathering all this in memory banks and then summing it up, you see. And it goes on. I'm sure you're aware of this unconscious process that goes on in your own life. You have raw experience, and then all of a sudden one day, without particularly thinking consciously of it, you've integrated unconsciously that experience. Well, this is going on. And the ego does act, Baba says, as the focal point around which this happens. So our own blessed ego accumulates, attracts like a magnet around it, the implications of a lot of experience, and even an experience of a previous lifetime, although lost to us in its specific detail, still from the essentialization leaking through from the mental body, and it does leak through the subconscious processes, and I suppose dreams are an important mechanism of this, but at any rate, it leaks through too. So the soul judgment pattern is seeping through in little flashes of rays of intuition and little gulps of honesty, and our own summarized experience from our mental body is leaking largely subconsciously through and beginning to give us suspicions and doubts. And finally, what happens? Well, the individual himself becomes eventually so disillusioned, so dissatisfied, so unhappy with the results. He himself begins to become more and more impatient to get somewhere. And so he speeds up the process. He's more brutally honest and ruthless with himself in his judgments. He doesn't blame. He doesn't hide the end implications of results from himself so much anymore. So he himself speeds up the process, trying desperately, increasingly, to find reality, dependability, truth. Lots of times we say happiness, satisfaction, all of these things. Call it what you may. The individual is grossly discontented, and he wants something that he can stand upon and which will warm him. When this happens, well, finally, the individual generates what Baba calls the energy of desperation. Now, it's awfully important to take quite seriously Baba's statement in several different situations that the entire inner process of going on the path, spiritual unfoldment of the individual, is entirely a matter of psychic energy. It involves psychic energy. It involves, first of all, the saving of the resources, the collecting together, and then the focusing and the directing of it. After all, that shouldn't be surprising, should it? If all of human incarnations are concerned with the gradual dissipation of sanskaras, and if Baba isn't kidding himself and us when he says that a sanskara is a psychic energy knot, well, it follows automatically without even any tiny jump in reasoning that the entire process of spiritual unfoldment, all of the process that is going to go on in the human incarnations until we reach perfection, has to do with psychic energy. Now, it's often seemed to me that there's a strange something involved in our ego and our focusing on separateness and our own identity in a given individual action situation which generates a sanskaric knot. I would like to make a hypothesis with you, and it's a working hypothesis, one in which you can do a tremendous amount of experimentation in your own personal life and see where it leads you. I would like to hypothesize the following, that if you act in any situation while the center of your consciousness is focused on yourself as a separate entity, and you are focusing upon the impact of the potential outcome of those actions upon you as a separate human being, then you generate a sanskaric knot of energy, which in turn will have to be dissipated again, and which in turn will almost certainly lead to another action generating another sanskaric knot. To the contrary, let us hypothesize that in any situation in which by one manner and another the individual his conscious self is focused outside of his own identity, his own body, his own desire patterns, while he is doing something, he is focused on anything outside of himself, then to a lesser extent, a subsequent sanskaric psychic knot of energy is generated. And to the extent that his focus of attention is focused outside of himself on truth, reality, and here, necessarily, of course, the greatest symbol being the avatar or a perfect one, to the extent that you are focused on such a being, a perfected being, then I would hypothesize that little or no counter-psychic energy is wrapped up into a samskaric knot. Now, if this is true, it explains the enormous importance of constantly holding in front of one really, deeply, sincerely, lovingly, the perfect one. And for us, of course, that is Meher Baba. Now, to me, this is a rather exciting concept, but I believe it is implicit in everything that Baba tells us to do, various different tips on the path that he constantly gives us. And think about it, at any rate. If this is a real thing, see what happens in your life. If when you go into a particular tough situation, if you start, first of all, before the situation starts to move, you focus first of all on Baba. And I don't care whether you say a prayer to Baba, please help me, or Baba, may your will be done, or Baba, please make that guy fall down and lie dead and let me have the $1,000 that I've got a right to, or whatever it is. The very act of focusing on Baba will be of enormous assistance in such case. Let's take just a little bit more look at the state of the human being when the samskaric knots have been loosened just enough by that some lack or lacks of lifetimes of personal experience, when he begins to reflect upon the results of all of those efforts, all of those goals, all of those attempts to hoodwink other, to rig circumstances and so on, somewhere or another to bring to fruition his own particular desire patterns. And as he becomes more and more disillusioned with the results of it, fed up, and starts to look for real answers, something that is a dependable base, a tremendous honesty comes over the individual. He begins to say to himself, I must have truth, regardless what is the cost, because instinctively he knows that there's no way finally to escape the truth, and that therefore the course of self-preservation, to eliminate self-destruction, which he has been constantly going through, must be based upon an honest search for whatever the truth is. Lots of times, of course, he has sort of a suspicion that the truth is going to be pretty god-awfully indigestible, difficult to live with. But as a matter of fact, all he has to do is to start a little bit of truthful search and to find a tiny bit of it, when he finds to his amazement that truth is not only acceptable, but enormously satisfying and exhilarating. But I've jumped again, I'm sorry. Let's go back to the individual as he gets to that state of divine desperation, where he must strike out and find the truth at any cost. It's also here where the enormous need of the individual to find oneness somewhere in his environment becomes so powerful. The desire to find love, to find understanding, to find containment. This I've witnessed so many times as I've seen different individuals come to the physical presence of Baba for the first time, see him, and immediately break into floods of tears. Man or woman, makes no difference. This was a majority reaction, because within oneself there is such a tremendous nervous tension by time one is ripe to come into the presence of a perfect one, particularly of the avatar. There's such an enormous nervous tension of need, of fulfillment, of tension of having struggled for it, looked for it, turned in every direction, fought and battled and plotted for it, and not finding it. It does lead to enormous and inner tension. And then one day, the individual, when the battle seems as if one is almost too tired to go on, as if perhaps one's nerves just simply cannot cope indefinitely with it, suddenly to be ushered into the presence of a being who one senses instantly is one with oneself and totally accepts what one is. It's almost too much. The release of this tension is overwhelming, and this is what produces the tears. It's not as if this were consciously formulated by the individual as he first comes into Baba's presence. It just happens that way. But if you go back and you think about it, what went on, the overwhelming release of tension, of finding that there is a being right in front of you, right with you, who knows and accepts totally, is tremendous. But at any rate, as the individual begins to search for honesty, then he searches also for real love, real understanding, and real encompassment. I've always been mystified that there are so many, really, thousands and thousands, and I'm sure millions, of superb, high-quality individuals in the world, all of whom are searching desperately to find such a sense of being met honestly, warmly, and lovingly by another being, and that this should be so pent up. Individuals who feel this way can look at each other and know each other for months and years, and still nothing ever happens to leap the barrier. We have such a high barrier and such deep suspicions and such deep convictions that there is not such a being, or else we look for such a being in such strange trappings that we don't know when he or she is right beside us. So, the other characteristic also, when the individual really gets down to the real battle of trying to get on with the truth, is that he's giving up kidding himself and others. In fact, he's even revolted by it. Anything other than trying to dress up a situation in something other than its real clothes is acceptable to him. So, a search for the truth, revolt with the manners in which people try artificially to doctor up situations, revolt and a hate even of oneself when one finds oneself doing it, and a deep search for broad encompassing love. And then, out of all of this, because one has gotten tired of pouring one's energies into the old patterns of success, because success has come into doubt. One doesn't know anymore what success is. And what happens out of this? Well, actually, there is a tremendous saving of energy that goes on. All of the energy that went into all those battles in the office, and battles with parents, and battles with a supposed loved one, and so on. That energy has been withdrawn. One is not willing to put it into situations anymore. And so here it is, all pent up in a reservoir. You might say something like a condensed lightning reservoir, swirling around inside, looking for some legitimate point at which to discharge. This is the real nature of the energy of desperation. And I might say that it is an extremely dangerous point. It is one in which, at which the individual can very easily become unbalanced. As a matter of fact, it's very often been pointed out that individuals So then, here we have the individual who is right at the edge of putting his foot onto the spiritual path. But you say, well, how's he find out where it is? Where does he get the clue? Well, this is a responsibility of the perfect ones. They are the ones who are aware of who is ready, and they are the ones who have the responsibility. Well, actually, the avatar has the total responsibility and lays out the path, and the perfect ones, after the avatar, simply have the job then of seeing that no undue accidents occur. So the avatar himself sees, in fact plots out the point at which the potential aspirant is then ready to make a conscious commitment, and the avatar turns up the clues to the path, almost always in the way of an individual who knows a bit more, or sometimes a good deal more. And then the aspirant is probably passed on from one individual to another, and then to another, until finally he comes to the particular path form which is most adapted to him, at least for that lifetime, or which even in, of course, in cases where he's not just starting on the path, but is continuing on the path form to which he has made a commitment in a previous lifetime. So, it is the avatar who determines this and who provides the clue. Now, usually the individual to whom the budding aspirant is directed has to put up with quite a good bit of guff, has to use a good deal of self-control in the situations, because after all, we're still so close to our ego, we're still so close to defining reality by our own internal drives, impulses, convictions. And these, after all, are 99.9% based upon sanskaric patterns, not upon truth and intuitions from the soul itself, but just plain old psychic energy, not physical, mechanical, sanskaric desire patterns. So for some time, there is quite a great deal of battle and argument. Very often, the novice aspirant will become quite disgusted with a particular line of attack which originally seemed very, very truth-giving. And after all, this has to be the avatar's pattern too, because the inner process is one of real learning. It's not just, let's say, a sudden straight drive by a rocket straight to heaven. It is a total learning, and in a very real sense of the word, unlearning process that goes on. And so as the individual begins to advance, he must go through certain negative phases of learning. He must unlearn certain things. He must see certain dangers and various aspects and various paths which he then begins to realize are not the truth, so that when he does find the truth, he will have the contrast to be able to choose. But suppose, let's say, after various different hits and misses hither and yon, and all his speed in going through this early initial shooting here and shooting a bit there and trying this and tasting that is determined by his own honesty and his own integrity. You know, there is the spiritual law that even if you choose a black master, your honesty and your love and your devotion to that individual will earn you the right for a true master. So your own honesty and integrity are the ingredients which determine how rapidly you get through those early stages before settling upon a path which is dynamic and which corresponds to your own inner needs. Eventually, of course, the individual finds a particular individual to whom he makes, usually consciously, a deep commitment. That's a difficult thing for us to do in our Western world because it goes so contrary to the grain of much of our tradition. But nevertheless, there is an extraordinarily important function which is fulfilled in such case. You know, this question of our ego is one of the keys which has to be resolved during our successive human reincarnations. Our ego is closely associated with our samskaras, but if there is some way of giving the strength, the monolithic quality, the imperviousness of our ego a shattering blow, then it is much easier for our consciousness, our conscious quality in given situations to focus somewhere else rather than on our own ego desires. So, what is the very best way of all? Well, of course, there is a killing way that can happen and often does happen to people, in which someone comes along, say someone that you love very dearly, and all of a sudden they turn you down and really shatter you by criticisms of your nature. At the time, this seems so absolutely, unbelievably cruel that one, after being shattered and after passing some time in almost desperation because of it and self-doubt, finally one finds that something terribly good has come, and that is a real crack has been made in this monolithic quality of the personal ego. But if it's not to be that or if it's to follow on behind that, because often we have to go through that process of having another loved one give a real crack in our ego before we have enough flexibility, enough openness to make the type of inner commitment that is necessary for real progress. After we have had that initial crack from another human being, then very often the next stage is to come across the individual who is to be the real guide, the real master for one. And what happens here? Well, we have so many of Baba's words from the discourses and so many other things that he has given to us that, first of all, love is the high road. One's longing for love can be met. The sense of being contained, of being fulfilled in another being, can be accomplished by the guide. So, if it becomes possible to form a deep commitment, a deep love, and a deep trust for the guide, and to the extent, as of course it is traditional in the Far East, that the good and the will of the guide is more important, more trusted than one's own, then an astonishing thing happens. And Baba calls that situation the formation of the provisional ego. The master himself in such a situation is substituted for our own ego, and for some period of time at least becomes the provisional ego in its place around which our actions occur. Now, during this time, our own personal ego is, as it were, put over into the deep freeze, but actually it's a deteriorating deep freeze. Our own personal ego is eternally and permanently weakened in that process and fractured in a way from which it never finally recovers. So, after we have developed this deep love and deep trust for the master, for the guide, if we are so lucky, and to such an extent, and so really, so deeply, not trying to do something, but it just is there. It's natural within us, natural within our feelings, that we trust and love that individual, so much so that literally, factually, our own sense of our own good is secondary or tertiary or not even thought about. Then this extraordinarily important and almost irreplaceable gift occurs of taking the master as our own provisional ego. Now, I certainly can't give any sort of a judgment as to how long this may last. I don't know. Maybe one individual for a relatively brief time, for another individual for a much longer period of time. But finally, inevitably, the master tosses back upon us the necessity of regrouping the events of our life around our own now largely weakened personal ego. We still love the master, we still look to him, but nevertheless, it becomes indelibly clear that we must take upon ourselves the individual decisions. We remain in deep, loving contact with him, even if he's dropped the body, as a matter of fact. But we go back. But no longer is our own personal ego that strong, monolithic, unthinking center of all action and desire. And in such case, if what I hypothesized to you just a few minutes ago is true, in such case our actions then accumulate a much weaker sanskaric pattern, or totally non-existent. So instead of accumulating new sanskaras, we are rapidly discharging the old ones. As the old ones are discharged, of course, then that barrier, the dust over the mirror of the soul, begins to diminish. Now, there's one phase of this process of the weakening of sanskaras that I haven't covered yet. I've concentrated, for the moment, of course, first of all on the early phase of the shaking the sanskaric knots before we start to come on the psychic path. That is a process of beginning self-education. Then, hopefully, comes the path of commitment to a master or a guide in the flesh. And also, if that does not occur, or simultaneous with it, or after because even after one has the close relation with the master, frequently one has to go on weakening and finally eliminating many of the Sanskaric knots more or less on one's own, at least much more on one's own than when one was close at the side of the master in the flesh. And Baba talks about a type of a learning process that goes on here. I especially like this. It appeals to me, and I think we have very much under-realized, under-focused on what Baba tells us here. He says that certain weak Sanskaric knots can be withheld from expression and eventually exhausted simply by either withholding them or a bit of even daydreaming and not putting them into physical action. But he said that there are certain strong ones, certain strong ancient ones, that cannot be dealt with this way. If we simply try to dam them up and put a barrier, that if we use the technique of simple sheer repression, that this does not work, that our own inner understanding and knowledge must be the final thing for the dissolution of these. And he does put it this way. He says that in the process of our going through experience, and honestly, clearly through experience, not kidding ourselves, honestly assessing the results, this allows the touchstone of our own soul to come through to judge true value. And by the inherent value of our own soul pattern, the quality of our Sanskaric knots is gradually changed, and our own impulse, our own desire patterns are gradually changed. This is what Baba defines as sublimation. Now, I think this is one of the most magnificent descriptions of a down-to-earth and an honest and a realistic learning pattern can possibly be. Take just a little bit of a look again at the honest ingredients. First of all, I've told you that the avatar is the chairman of the board of the universe, and he maps out the events of our lives aimed at the most efficient resolution and dissipation of our Sanskaric psychic energy knots. So the experience that comes to us is directed by the master man himself, the avatar. Secondly, we have within our own selves, within our own imaginarily separated entity, our drop soul and three bodies, we have the touchstone to truth and all knowledge, our own soul. So, here we have the avatar setting up a situation on the outside, our soul on the other side, and here is a nutcracker with our sanskaras right in the middle. And if we have a good quota of honesty, of not pulling the wool over our eyes, of being brutally clear with ourselves as to what is happening in the situation, then in the nutcracker, between the avatar-designed pattern of external experience and the touchstone of value of our own soul, we modify the quality and the pattern of the Sanskaric impulses to action. And this Baba calls sublimation. What an enormously different definition of sublimation from what you and I have been used to. Normally we think of sublimation of saying, oh hell, the devil's got me by the tail, I want to do so-and-so and so-and-so, and I know it is mean and naughty and reprehensible and backwards, but I still feel like I ought to do it, and along comes maybe your conscience says, well, now look, Johnny, you ought to sublimate that and think about going out instead and working in the garden or looking at the sunset or helping Great Aunt Mary out for a walk in the sunshine so she gets her rheumatism a little loosened up. That's the sort of way we usually talk about sublimation, and it's so close to repression that I think you do the same thing that I've always done. I have a red alarm bell ringing as to how effective and how honest that is. But Baba doesn't define sublimation in that fashion. He says many experiences, for better or for worse, we will have to go through. But as we go through them, and I put another tip in there, a suggestion, as you know that you're going into a difficult situation in life, quickly call on Baba. Not for guidance necessarily. I mean, not for conscious guidance. He's not going to set a stroke of lightning into heaven and say, dear boy, do this, or dear girl, do that. But open your heart to him and say, I know this is your situation, but you're trying to teach me something, and help me to understand what you were trying to teach me. All right? That gives the maximum of flexibility to you and opens up to the maximum an internal channel up through the subtle body and up through the mental body and up to your own soul function. It puts aside your ego, which is what your mental body samskaras prey on, and you have a maximum chance of your own soul function to come through with the touchstone of the philosopher. Well, again, between loving the master in the flesh, the guide in the flesh, and regarding life about one as the great laboratory designed for us, astonishingly selfishly for us, for our own inner needs, and all we have to do is to open ourselves up as much as we can and hold on and know that the avatar has designed the learning cycle in a fashion for which we have the capabilities and the power, the resistance, and the aid, or everything that's necessary to go through it. Usually it's either fear or our own desire pattern which makes any sort of learning tough. So much for sublimation. All right, as the individual, one way or another, begins to make a little bit of progress in unknotting sanskaras, discharging the psychic energy knots, then of course what begins to happen is that the soul begins to shine through more and more. The mental body material begins to leak through more and more. One has more intuitions. One seems to sense things, to know things one didn't know before. It may be that 3 lifetimes ago you were a great mathematician, and this lifetime you didn't study mathematics, but now you begin to know how to keep the family accounts, and you even look at a trigonometric equation or something to do with calculus, and strangely enough it makes sense, because that quality, that capability of 3 lifetimes before can now begin to come through more readily from the unconscious. So, one begins to have intuitions, but now let's stop right there, because here is an extraordinarily important point in one's ongoing. When something comes to your conscious mind, other than a physical experience and physical environment, when something comes to your conscious mind and you say, I have an idea, or I have an intuition, or I have a hunch, and you go ahead and follow it, you have, of course, and I have, of course, because we're not perfect ones, we're not even close to it, we have absolutely no idea what the source of that hunch, idea, or intuition was. Now, let me point out several different possibilities to you. One is that it came from your own soul pattern, that an arrow was sent flying by your soul and it went through the mental body and through the subtle body and into your conscious brain and produced a conscious thought with you. It may be that. It's not terribly likely, but it could be. Or it may also be that it's part of something stored in your own mental body. Now, your own mental body, of course, is an enormous repository of all types of experiences. Some of them still pretty fouled up, some of them which have gone through a great deal of resolution already, and we have stored within our own mental body many things which are already quite wise, quite freed, quite liberated. And so it's possible that one of these idea arrows has come from a part of your own unconscious, your own mental body, from an area which is quite resolved. And it turns out to be a pretty darn good base for action. But let me caution you, it may very well be that 2 days after it, or 2 minutes afterwards, another idea pops up in your mind. Or maybe it's 2 months later and you say, gee, that other bright idea that cropped up just like this and with the same force worked out so beautifully, and here's another one, obviously this has to be right. But how do you know that it didn't come from a really messed up sanskaric portion of your mental body black box tape recorder? You don't know. As a matter of fact, the sanskaric knot, when it's discharged, it comes out with a lot of energy. It picks up energy from the subtle body, and that motivates our muscles, and we get on with something. So most of our getting on with something is motivated by just simple, crude, raw Sanskaric patterns. And as some of those become lighter and lighter and more enlightened, and we become more free in certain aspects of our nature, then let us say certain parts of our nature begin to act in a more released and liberated, a more healthy, and in a more balanced fashion. But we don't know when something comes from the unconscious to the conscious mind where it came from. There are also, in some circumstances, the possibilities that a disincarnate entity managed to make contact with your unconscious and sent a bolt through too. Usually this doesn't happen because normally we have a natural, let us say, brick wall surrounding our own unconscious, and that normally cannot be penetrated by another entity. At least, usually not an entity which is of a grossly different grade of development. But at different times or circumstances, and in different individuals' cases it may vary a great deal, it can be possible for another disincarnate entity to get a thought or an impulse through. But believe me, a disincarnate entity, just because he has dropped the body, is no closer to the truth than you or I are. The only thing that happens when you and I drop the body is that the physical shield to emotional impact is greatly weakened. It isn't there. So as a consequence, we feel good and bad more than we did when we had the physical body. But the Sanskaric knots haven't changed. The sheer fact of dropping the physical body has not resolved a single one of them, put us any closer to God realization. So if a disincarnate entity happens to get an impulse pattern through your subconscious to your conscious, and even if you have, let's say, the sort of strange type of a gift which can see that disincarnate entity and identify it, it still has absolutely nothing to do with dependability or health. They're just as hard up to get on with the path and the truth as you and I are. In fact, many of them much harder up because they don't have a physical body around to get on with the thing. They're in a digestive interim process. So have a caution. Have a caution. Yes, as you begin to feel freer and freer within yourself, less and less compelled, yes, this is a sign that Sanskaric knots are being loosened and eliminated even. And more the soul can shine through. And more worked out phases of our own mental body experience can shine through and give us a broader base, a more secure base, and we call these intuitions. But the very fact that at one point something shines through which turns out to be balanced and dependable does not mean that the next one will be equally so. So have a care and never try to put it on to another human being that you're some sort of an infallible source for wonderful hunches and intuitions, not even for yourself. Put them on file many times. Wait a bit. Judge them as much as you can with your conscious self, what your conscious mind has available. After all, another thing happens too. Any of you who have studied physics and know force vectors know that if something is pushing in one direction and all of a sudden a force comes along from the side, it modifies the trajectory. So you can have a soul arrow coming through, which then has to go through a fouled up part of your subconscious, and that soul arrow either completely deflected or partly modified. So we can have intuitions which are largely balanced, but which have some very unbalanced aspects to them. So if we just suddenly glom onto them, grab hold of them, and trust them implicitly 100%, we're doing violence to our own good sense and to our own helpmate, our own intellect, and our own sense of honesty. So as you begin to go into increasingly intuitive qualities in your life, remember, have a care. Now, as we're going along in the lessening gradually of the Sanskaric pattern, the individual begins automatically and naturally to ascend what the mystics Baba described as the planes. You remember there are 7 of them, and the first three, if one is not being carried under the veil, that means without any sort of conscious experience or conscious realization of how and where one is progressing. And if one is not carried under the veil, then these are the planes where one has experience of unusual sights, odors, and sounds. There is, for instance, the discussion of the music of the spheres or the seeing of beautiful colors. And individuals who have these experiences become quite bemused by them. But Baba points out to us that the experiences of the plane, well, yes, maybe interesting signposts, are still experiences of duality, within duality, and therefore help us not at all in getting on with the path. It's just as if they're signposts going by. So don't try to have more of them if this happens to be your path. Baba points out so beautifully again that one can become even more bewitched by the experiences of the subtle planes than of the physical plane, because we equate spirituality with it. Just as, for instance, we have always equated spirituality with the performance of miracles. And this is something which, of course, largely comes from our Christian tradition. The Catholics use as one of their most fundamental criterion of judging of the sainthood of an individual by his having performed 2 physically verifiable physical miracles. And yet this is just exactly what Baba tells us: beware, have a caution, hold up. It is our responsibility in some way or another, at any time that we have experiences, are able to perform things that are supernatural, to use within that circumstance the inner sense of reassurance and reinforcement that it gives us, and then to assist our master by deliberately not wishing to have another one. Every time that our mind begins to come back to the wonder and the beauty of it, and we find ourselves unconsciously wanting to have another, it is our responsibility to close that off. Baba says that a real master gives only very, very rarely a so-called spiritual or occult experience to an aspirant, and then only in a case of either an emergency or to underline and to reinforce at a critical point his own inner conviction. And then in another place, Baba says, having done that, the master must immediately go about disenchanting the individual, disconnecting him from the wish to have more such experiences. Believe me, I've seen individuals who became wrapped up for an entire lifetime in just such bewitchments, and the illusion that this was real spirituality, and that it constituted and was a sign of spiritual progress. Baba says it is not necessarily a sign of spiritual progress. It may be a natural byproduct of spiritual progress, but does not have value within itself unless given by the master in a very specialized, specific circumstance. So again, your and my job is to get on with the job, and if it is Baba's will that we have such a big experience, all right, let's have it, and extract right down to the husk, to the bone, the meat that he has given on us, and then forget it, get on. For the problem, of course, of the occult and of occult forces comes to a head is when the individual drop soul entity progresses on to the 4th plane, where Baba explains he has access to all energy. And on the other hand, his moral resources are not yet developed to the point where he will necessarily have the strength to control his impulses in the exercise of the forces now at his fingertips. I'd like to point out one thing to you, and that is there are quite a great many people, quite a great many groups in the world whose activities, aspirations, develop around the use of so-called psychic or occult forces. And they utilize these forces to accomplish one thing or another, very often healing and one cannot help but be enormously touched by their devotion, their goodwill, and it is usual for such individuals to explain to you that, of course, this power and this strength is not their own, that it comes from a universal force or it comes from God, however the individual may want to express it. Now, did it ever occur to you that if Baba's description of the planes is correct, and that access to universal force comes only in the fourth plane, then obviously all of these individuals who exercise these so-called psychic powers cannot be on the fourth plane. In fact, a great majority of them just have to be below the fourth plane, and probably in most instances not even yet on the first plane. So I would say to you that my own observation is that a majority of people who use psychic and occult powers over decades of their lives, in most instances, become psychically exhausted. They make me think of people who are sort of walking around in a dream. And I look at it in my own mind. I don't know if this is a correct symbolism, metaphor. I look at it myself as if each of us has a tank of psychic energy. And flowing into it is a natural pipe, not a terribly large diameter, but a pipe that keeps coming in and gives us a certain amount of renewing energy constantly. Enough to get on with the usual jobs and usual situations. But I believe what happens is that an individual who finds certain psychic keys then puts a pipe over into that normal personal energy tank and draws off great big gulps of it, gallons and gallons in various different directions. And it is not inexhaustible. So finally, after some time of drawing in this fashion, and with the old intake pipe still limited diameter with a limited trickle coming in, the individual does finally become psychically exhausted. Secondly, of course, if what Baba tells us that the entire spiritual path and spiritual unfoldment is a matter of psychic energy, and if we do not have the psychic energy disposal in the early phases to put in from our side, do we expect the Master to make a gift of it? Well, there's an awful lot of earning that has to go on from our side. There has to be, this is why so many individuals, even after they have the energy of desperation, which Baba says is necessary to make real progress on the spiritual path, still the individual finds that he must go over the various activities in his life, select, give priorities, discard some, bring others to an end. He must go through a very realistic process of dealing with psychic energy. And so if it is true that we do not have use, we do not have access to universal energy until we hit the fourth plane, then for heaven's sake, be careful how you handle your own potential psychic energy within your own psychic energy tank. Are you dissipating it needlessly through various different experiments and so on, or are you keeping it for the deeply necessary internal unfoldment, which really has nothing to do with occult and psychic experiences except as a pure byproduct? Of course, you're all familiar with Baba's statement that the one great chance for reversal of consciousness, of the process of coming to consciousness and perfecting consciousness, can occur on the fourth plane when the individual may use for totally selfish forces this universal energy. And if he does for totally selfish and destructive purposes, and if, let's say, a perfect master has not saved him from a situation, but has only saved the rest of the world from his misdirection, then that soul goes crashing back down to the stone stage and must gradually, laboriously work his way back up. So much for the fourth plane. But always remember, that any type of experiences are still experiences of materiality and illusion. And they can be even more binding, subtly binding, than our experiences in the gross. So we can get hung up on them even more subtly than just going out and always wanting to have a big beefsteak or I don't know, whatever, simple gross pleasure. Incidentally, I like beefsteak very much myself, so let's get off of that one. In addition to the psychic energy that we may dissipate, of course, one does not want to focus where there is no real value. Real value is an internal process in which the avatar himself has laid out the learning processes, and if we're lucky, we have a master in the flesh who can help us with those, help to support us, help to interpret, and sometimes challenge us within them. Let's go on. After the fourth plane, the individual comes to the fifth plane, which is the plane of sainthood, in which he becomes aware of God and can see God, but not constantly, and has the typical qualities of the saint. Many of you have known or heard of Inayat Khan. Baba said he was a typical and a beautiful saint of the fifth plane. The sixth plane, one sees God constantly, but everywhere around one, and one does not know oneself yet as God, as oneself. It is not emergence. Finally, after some time, some experiences on the sixth plane, then finally the individual, with the intercession of another perfected one, achieves the seventh plane. Having achieved the seventh plane, one knows oneself as God. But of course, knowing oneself as God, one is unaware at that point of creation. Some individuals who know themselves as God drop the body, Baba says, immediately. Some continue in the body for some time, and some go on for another journey, which is that of gradually coming back to consciousness of illusion. So if the individual is conscious both of his Godhead and of creation, which is illusion, that is a perfected one. There are, in addition to the five perfect masters, I think it's usually three others who are perfected, aware of both creation and their godhood, but who do not function in any spiritual hierarchic manner. They are not one of the five perfected masters. And then, of course, there is still the further journey in which the one who is aware of both illusion and his Godhead exercises his powers within creation for the help of the ongoing of the souls within creation. And then finally, after that individual drops the body, that consciousness is reunited consciously with God eternally, with all of the characteristics and the qualifications of the perfected consciousness that were developed and perfected by that dropped soul. Well, this is one of the things that I feel is extremely important, and that is that each dropped soul realizes itself eventually as God, but with a unique individual contribution of consciousness. A particular dropped soul goes through an enormous pattern of challenge within duality, but a very specific pattern. And so what is contributed by, let's say, drop soul Sai Baba is not the same contribution of consciousness as that contributed by Upasni Maharaj, nor will it be one day for Dick or Kathy or Don or Peter or Jack. There are no two drop soul consciousness contributions which are the same. They are all different. And because God's consciousness, of course, like all of God, must be infinite, it takes an infinitude of drop souls going through an infinitude of challenge within creation to fill the tank of God's infinite consciousness of himself. No two individuals will ever repeat the same pattern. And hence the necessary conclusion of, for instance, the Sufi mystics, that the inner ongoing process of perfecting of each drop soul must be individual and different. There are certain basic patterns and characteristics that are identical or very closely similar, so certain things can be done in group activities. But certain final things are so highly individualistic that at most they can be shared between a guide and an aspirant. I would say, finally, that what many people regard as the horror, the sadness, the brutality of creation is only a very superficial surface aspect of it. And only because we do not have the total context which total time brings to all events. If I give you my personal opinion and reading, creation is an impossibly optimistic success story, because there is no way finally to go down to defeat. Everything is saved, everything is balanced out, and everything, sooner or later, regardless of the harrowing turns that are gone through, comes through to the home goal, which is realization of one's own self as God. I hope that there may be, within all of this, a few interesting new ways of looking at what Baba has told us about creation. Not because there's anything new in it, but simply because each person, in reflecting within himself, turns up a few things that gets him excited. And over the course of more than 30 years now, there have been quite a few of them which have struck home so forcefully to me. So I've enjoyed sharing these with you, and I look forward at any point that it may work out that way for some of the things that you would like to share with me on it as well. Baba be with you.